Dr. Kristina Hufford is an associate professor in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management. Her research focuses on rangeland restoration and native plant population genetics. And this is a project that we initiated 2 years ago?
It's in 2016. I was looking at our notes and it was like, has it been that much time?
Yeah, so a very specific question that we're trying to learn about. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristina here.
Okay, so I'm not accustomed to using these devices, so can everybody hear me? You can all hear me okay? Great, okay, welcome. This is a project I started with and working in coordination with Brian, and my background is restoration and restoration ecology, and Waiano is particularly good for all of this type of work because we don't really have an irrigated system out here. There's now that center in town for all of this work, and instead what we see is a site here where there's a lot of experimentation you can do if you're interested in bringing back native species. And so one of the ideas in restoration ecology is, well, if you're standing in a field like this one, which is really weedy, 95% or more, I'd say non-native species. If we want to actually turn that back to something more desirable, in our case, a native species, what would you do? And so the big trend is this idea of creating a restoration island, because the amount of work that it would take to restore a field like this to native species is usually well beyond our time and also our finances to do. And so we went ahead and we planted in a field pattern here, basically different methods of testing, planting native species back in a weedy environment and seeing whether or not we can create these restoration islands. And we tried 2 different methods, and I don't know if we can advance the slides.
That's the one you want, or do you want your strategy slide?
Let's go with strategy. So you're looking at 12 plots. The 12 plots were all set up and planted with the same native grass species. We focused on native grass cultivars you're probably all familiar with. Many of the cultivar names are up there if you want to come up and take a closer look later. And the goal was that these grasses would be pretty aggressive, so they might have some chance of establishing in this weedy environment. And of the 12 plots, 4 were treated with herbicide, that's glyphosate, and 4 plots were solarized and 4 were controls. And if you're wondering what solarization is, there you go. We had these large, thick plastic out for a while, and it actually wouldn't fire growing season, I suppose. Yeah. And if you take a look after it's been out there for a while, and you might have to come up and take a look, the plastic literally cooks all the plants underneath. And so this is a method used in horticulture, and it has been used now in some restoration environments. And you find you cook all of the natives underneath, and you can even sometimes sterilize the soil to the point where now it's potentially more likely that you would get your native species back in. So that's essentially the work that we've got there now. I've got the 2017 data up there, but it's relatively simple. We found 2 things so far because this is a longer process. First off, the control plots had about 60% of the species in the herbicide or the solarized plots. So by killing the dominant species on the surface, it appears we released the weed seed bank. And since I had also hand planted about 5,000 native grass seeds per plot, because I kind of overdid it deliberately trying to get them in there, some of that seed bank are in fact our native species. And in that first year, we found that only 1 of our control plots had one of the native grasses that we'd planted come up, but all 4 of the herbicide and the solarized plots had at least 1 native species come up, and that would have been, in that case, a squirrel tail, which seems to be more aggressive, and so is a little bit better at establishing in a weedy environment. So, of course, our goal, right, is that if you establish a native grass island in the middle of weeds, that it will be providing seeds nearby, it's going to eventually spread, and it at least provide some habitat and diversity in the process. And if you take a walk through, let's see if we can start walking through. It's hard to see because we still have, obviously, a great many weeds in here. But if you start looking, and we'll come up to this cheatgrass kind of dominated plot over here. This is a plot that was treated with the glyphosate, and you see primarily what's coming up there in the midst of all the cheatgrass is the squirrel tail. So we're beginning to establish those native grasses over time in what is essentially a massively weedy site. And of course you can see even with our treatments, we're drowning in weeds. And we have at this point in time with our most recent data collection episode, which was last weekend, so we haven't analyzed the data yet. All of our species that we planted have come up at some point in these plots except for blue grama, and that could literally be because blue grama is a later season species and or it's so much shorter we're not seeing it in the midst of all this. So what you might notice is that we still have a lot of weeds, right? It's not like our aggressive grasses really did the job we were hoping they would do, and this was kind of a learning experience for me too. Because we all know, for example, in bindweeds out here, it's just everywhere. I mean, it's coming up in my turf grass and Laramie at home too. So obviously bindweeds have no problem competing with grasses. So we may have to do a little more work out here, but it's pretty amazing because the amount of weeds that are here normally would prevent any native species from establishing. And we are seeing the native grasses come up. And so now the question is, since this is at a slower pace than we planned, do we want to introduce another treatment? And that might be a broadleaf herbicide if we want to do that, if we don't just want to wait. Or alternatively, we may come back in and apply herbicide again to the herbicide plots and solarize on the plots that were solarized, because what really got me started on this in the first place is I've actually seen this done on beach dunes. And out in west, a lot of plantings out there deliberately by the transportation department of a succulent from South Africa called ice plant has taken over all of those natural environments. And so folks out there will do the same thing. They'll put down even black garbage bag plastic to try to kill the ice plant. And what we discovered is after cooking all of those plants, what was coming up underneath, even while the plastic was on, were native plants. So the question is, can we do that here too? Can we knock back some of the invasive weeds, either with herbicide or with plastic, depending on what makes most sense for you and for managing your environment. So I invite you to take a look around and to talk to us about if you have any questions. And I'd love to hear from you as well. If you're in a situation like this one, what steps have you taken to knock back some of the species that are really not working for you? I know that bindweed is universally pretty much disliked. So I would love to hear, again, if any folks here too have been working on it as well. Yeah.
What about simulated grazing? If they're going to be in a natural system, the rancher trying to do some of that, they're going to have their livestock. Everything in here, even the cheatgrass when it's younger, is palatable to cattle. Bindweed is very palatable. In fact, they'll keep it under control. And simulation, you're using mowing, to try to simulate maybe an intensive type grazing, mow it down, give a chance. That as a treatment as well, because to be realistic and for a ranch system to be putting in a field that they're going to try to reclaim, they're going to have their livestock out there, and it's a forage resource that can be used. It's just getting the natives to give them a chance, because right now you got so much shading and everything going on anyway. So to me, if you can knock that down, usually a lot of times in seedings, we'll recommend, like in the CRP days, go ahead and mow.
Yep.
Your seedlings they're coming aren't, but go ahead and mow, open it up so sunlight can get to them.
It's a really good idea. So simulated grazing, I think, is something that would be worth testing. And even in a system where, in fact, you would have active grazing, that might be worth testing. For this stage of our experiment, we haven't added more factors because we only have 12 plots. But I think as we develop this project and consider all of the possibilities, actually even considering some active grazing in the environment would be useful.
So last fall, we did do some residue management with our sheep in here last fall, dormant season going into winter, to take some of that litter and everything off of these plots.
That would help too, but
So we
even
did
at
do
this
that last
stage,
fall.
to keep it from getting like this, I think opening up that the light and everything would actually speed up the chance that the perennials that you seeded would get going.
Yes.
So it's I can understand why you did what you done and at this stage, but it's something to definitely consider.
Absolutely.
Here in the future to see.
Well, and there's still a question out there about whether or not restoration islands in a dryland system are really something that will work over time. And so there have been some folks lately who have been talking about how well this works in a tropical system where you can establish like islands of tropical rainforests in areas that have been heavily impacted, and they will spread very rapidly. But we don't really know what's going to happen in our arid or semi-arid system here in a place, for example, like Wyoming. So there are a lot of things that need to be tested, and I agree that there are probably several other factors we can introduce to the experiment and see whether or not we can speed up this process.
I think it will spread. It just, obviously take plenty longer time.
Yeah, exactly.
So ma'am, is this your most successful plot right here?
Not necessarily, no. All of them are actually relatively well, say for the controls at least based on the first year's data were not doing well at all. So if we had not treated anything other than simply preparing the site and seeding it, I mean, that's 5,000 native plant seeds, and we see very few native plants.
Because like I look at it from the private sector, okay, so the methane is going away, and they're coming in and restoring stuff, okay? So if I had a contractor that came and did that and it looked like that,
no,
it's not going to work for me.
Exactly. This is why we're now considering what our next step would be, because even though I see it progressing, and I'm impressed to see that the natives are establishing even without our help, because I mean, they're in there fighting. You'll find there's squirrel tail on here that's literally been completely covered with bindweed, so we were having a laugh earlier because it looks like the bindweed is propping it up. But clearly for a system where you need to meet some type of regulatory requirement, this is going to require additional treatment. So as we start these studies, we often then step back because we don't want to rush ourselves. But now the question is, what would the next treatment be that might help to speed this along?